This is the Lenovo ThinkPad laptop/tablet computer, model X230T. The T indicates it's a tablet convertible. There's also a regular model X230 without the T. That's just a regular laptop. I acquired this laptop computer basically for nothing. It was heavily used. It looks a bit beat up. It also appears that somebody has worked on it in the past. This device has a special hinge. This device has a special hinge on it, which allows it to open up like a regular laptop computer. It also spins 180 degrees, allowing it to become a tablet. Now, here's the problem that this computer is having. When the screen is tilted back, it just falls. It's lost its grippiness. You go beyond about 30 degrees and down it goes. Okay, so there is something wrong with this hinge. We are going to need to expose that hinge to see if we can see what the problem is. Before we work on the laptop computer, we should do some simple common sense things. First, we'll remove the battery. There are two buttons on the underside of the computer, located here and here. This first button is a lock. You flip that outward to unlock it, and then you push this one to the side, and now you can just slide out the battery. Now on the right side of the laptop, there's this pointing device. We'll go ahead and remove that. No reason to leave that in there. And we'll go ahead and remove the disk drive. There is a cover over the disk drive, and that cover is held on with this screw. We'll go ahead and just remove that screw. Now we can remove that cover. And that exposes the disk drive. Just grab this little plastic tab, and the disk drive slides right out. One good practice that I like to follow is to keep track of all the tiny little screws that come out of these things and put them somewhere safe. I like to use these little pill jars for holding tiny little screws. If those tiny little screws fall into the carpeting, there's a good chance you'll never find them again. On the lower part of the screen housing, there is this plastic piece. This plastic piece can be removed. It is called the button bezel, and removing this will partially expose the hinge. The button bezel is held on by 5 screws. All of these screws are hidden under small decorative black plastic covers. The manual calls these covers wafer heads. 3 of these screws are on the front, and they're located here, here, and here. The other 2 screws are located on the sides, here, and here. The wafer heads on the front are round, and the screws underneath them are 5 millimeters long. The wafer heads on the side are square, and the screws underneath them are 2 millimeters long. These little covers are glued on. You just have to get some sharp little object underneath them and start to peel them up, and then usually your fingernail will get them off the rest of the way. They are purely decorative. They aren't really needed, so there's no problem if you don't replace them. But if you do decide to replace them, you'll probably have to apply some adhesive to get them to stick back on again. I've gone ahead and removed those plastic covers on those screws, and now you can see the screws better. In order to remove these screws, you need a really tiny Phillips head screwdriver. I will start with the screws on the front. Okay, that's got the 3 screws on the front. Now for the screws on the side. Okay, the 2 screws on the side have been removed. Now we can carefully remove this front plastic piece. Just be careful to remember there's a cable under here for this fingerprint reader. This front plastic piece has now been freed up. Now there's an electrical connector here. We're going to go ahead and disconnect this fingerprint reader. It is a very tiny connector. Be careful with it. Okay, that's now disconnected. On the button bezel, an awful lot of these tiny little clips are already broken off. That really confirms that somebody's been in here before. Now we have exposed the hinge so that we can get a better look at it. Now the screen is connected to this piece, and the main body of the computer is connected to this piece and this center piece. And you can see where the problem is right there. There's a fracture right there on that casted piece of metal right there. So as I move this thing, this hinge on this side is moving normally, and this side isn't moving because it's now been mechanically disconnected because of that fracture. Next, we need to remove the keyboard. And for that, we're going to flip the laptop upside down. On the underside, there is this cover over the memory chips. Now there are these two screw holes here and here. These two screws are what holds on the keyboard. And there is a little icon of a keyboard that is right next to these screws. We'll go ahead and remove those screws now. The two screws are out. These two screws are 5mm in length. Now the keyboard is loose. We just want to push it all the way up like this, exposing these little clips underneath here. And we'll just give it a little bit of a help with our screwdriver. And that gets it loose. We need to expose the cable. Now this is the cable that plugs in the keyboard. We will carefully remove it. Okay, now we can remove the keyboard completely. The next thing that has to come off is this thing here, known as the palm rest. The mouse pad is integrated with it. Flipping the laptop back over again, on the underside we see 5 screws here, 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 and here. These 5 screws hold on the palm rest. They can be identified with this little rectangular symbol right there. All 5 of the screws have that symbol on them. We'll go ahead and remove those screws now. All 5 of these screws are 5mm in length. Before we remove the palm rest, note there is a cable connecting the palm rest to the rest of the computer. We should disconnect that now before trying to pull off the palm rest. This flat cable is held on with a flip lock. Just get our thumbnail under it and flip it up. We just pull on this little purple pull tab, and now it's free. Now we will pull off the palm rest, starting at the top, unhinging things. Okay, the palm rest is now free. With the palm rest removed, we expose this cluster of wires, which is running from the screen section down to the right lower corner here. Inside of the screen housing are antenna wires. And that's what these are. These are antenna wires, and they run down to whatever communications is available on this laptop. Now here we have a Wi-Fi module. Now we have 4 wires in here, and they are blue, red, gray, and black respectively. The black and the gray are connected to this Wi-Fi module. The red and the blue aren't connected to anything right now, although they could be connected to something like, say, a Bluetooth module if one was available. So there is a spot available there in case you want to add other communications in the future. We're going to go ahead and pull off these RF cables. Very small. I have to sort of pry them off here without damaging them. Now these wires sort of snake their way through this little channel here back to the monitor housing, but they go under a series of these little tabs or holders, whatever you want to call them. We're going to have to pull them out. We're going to slide them under one after the other. This one goes to the right, to the left, to the right, and up, and then to the left. And we now have those free. Next, we have this great big sheet of plastic here that needs to be removed. The manual calls this the keyboard bezel. Now on the top side, there are 3 screws, here, here, and here. Now this one screw is in the channel that holds the communications wires. Just keep that in mind when you're putting it back together, that has to go in before the wires. We're going to go ahead and remove those 3 screws now. These 3 screws are 3.5 millimeters in length, and they are different than the other screws in that they are silver in color rather than black. Back on the bottom of the laptop, we have basically 5 screws left to remove, and those are the ones that are holding on the keyboard bezel. I'm going to flip this around so the top is on the bottom. Now those screws are located here, 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 and here, and then one other right here. We're going to go ahead and remove those screws now. These 2 screws that were under where the battery is normally located are 3 millimeters in length, and the other 3 screws are 5 millimeters in length. Now we are back on the upper side. One thing to notice here, we have now exposed the CMOS battery. If you've been having any trouble with time and date, this battery probably needs to be replaced. You could actually check the voltage on it now. It should be 3.0 volts. If it's below, say, 2.7 volts, I would probably just go ahead and replace it. You'll probably need to replace it in the next several months anyway. Now, in order to remove the keyboard bezel, the first thing we have to do is bring up the screen and then turn it 90 degrees sideways. Now we can get underneath the keyboard bezel and start prying it up. Okay, now it's loose, and we can just slide it forward. Now, one thing to remember, these wires are going to have to go on top when you slide it back in again. And here is that entire keyboard bezel. Now this screen enclosure, or what the manual calls CRT unit, is connected to the main body of the computer, obviously first through these communications lines, which we have already released. But now there are still 2 cables left, these 2 gray lines here, and those are both held in with these flip type connectors. And when we release those, then all the wires connecting the CRT unit to the body of the computer will be released. Okay, now all the cables are released. Now that the keyboard bezel has been removed, we get a full view of that hinge mechanism. There is this plastic cover over the hinge. This thing is called the hinge cap, and that's going to need to come off. Now I'm filming this part a little bit out of order because the first time I shot it, it didn't come out right. So you notice the keyboard bezel is still in place in this filming. It doesn't really matter at what point you remove the hinge cap. To remove the hinge cap, you start from the rear, fold the screen down all the way, and then you pop this up a little bit. There's a couple of latches there, and you get that up as far as you can. Now you have to get to the front of it. Now we go to the front and we tilt the screen all the way up. And we've got to get something under here to get this out of here. And out it comes. And that exposes all the wires that run through this special two-way hinge. Now this hinge is held on by 4 screws, 2 in the front and 2 in the back. We're going to start with the back ones. So the computer is now closed. We're looking at the back. We're going to take off these 2 back screws. Now we have flipped the screen back up again, and we're looking from the front. We're going to take out these 2 screws. Now the CRT unit is free. And out it comes with all of its cables. And those 4 screws were 6 millimeters in length. I'm just going to look at a wider view of this whole area now. See, as it comes out, all the wires come with it. Now we have that hinge fully exposed. You can see how the wires run through the center of it. And here's our crack right there. Now this hinge is held on with screws here and here. And that should get the hinge off the CRT unit. Two screws are 6 millimeters in length. Now the hinge should simply come off. And here's the broken piece, which of course is separated. And the wires will just slide right through. I'm going to pull out these communications wires first. Now these are going to be a little trickier. Okay, there's one. This one seems a little bit wide. I hope I don't damage that connector. Okay, that's it. The old hinge has been completely removed. This is the replacement hinge. I bought this on eBay. It is secondhand. You can see it looks kind of cruddy, but it does appear to function and it appears to turn normally. So we're going to go ahead and put that in as a replacement for the broken one. Before we start to reassemble, I thought we should just summarize the screws that we had to take out and make it a little easier to remember how to put them back in. We've encountered 4 types of screws of 2 different diameters. There's M2.5 screws, and those are all 6 millimeters in length. And then there's M2 screws, and those come in 3 millimeters and 3.5 millimeters and 5 millimeters in length, respectively. The 6 millimeter M2.5 screws are used in 2 places, on the front of the button bezel and on the hinge. Now, on the hinge, 4 of them connect the hinge to the base, and 2 of them connect the hinge to the screen. The 3 millimeter M2 screws are used in 2 places, on the sides of the button bezel, and connecting the keyboard bezel from the underside where the battery is located. The 3.5 millimeter M2 screws are used to connect at the top of the button bezel. Remember, one of them is where the RF wires run through that little trench. The most numerous by far are these M2 5 millimeter screws. We removed 10 of them. So all the screws other than these are M2 5 millimeters. All of these cables from the LCD unit have got to go through this hole in the hinge. There are 2 cables which go from the LCD screen to the body of the laptop. Now one is a little bit bigger than the other. Now this bigger one doesn't exactly fit, and so you have to bend it a little bit in order to get it to go. That always makes me nervous. You could always damage the cable or the connector by bending it like that, but that's the only way to get it to go. So I would start with the biggest one because it's going to need the most room. Next is the smaller connector. Now there's room for this. It goes through fine. Now we have the 4 RF lines, And we will put those in. I'm going to start with the black and the gray ones first. They are the longest. Trying not to entangle anything. Try to keep them as untangled as possible because this thing is in a hinge which is going to have to twist. Now we will take the red and blue ones. My biggest concern about this is getting all these lines in such a way that they don't bind up and damage each other. Remember, this thing has to turn 180 degrees. Okay, all the lines are in now. Now we're going to reattach the hinge to the LCD screen. Before you start, it might be a good thing just to sort of prop up the LCD screen with a little box or something like that. It kind of makes it a little easier to work. And you want to have the hinges oriented this way before you begin, so they line up with the holes. We will now attach the screen with two 6mm screws. Now we will attach the hinge to the body of the laptop. Make sure we pull all these forward and get them out of the way. We'll line it up there. There are two 6mm screws that go in the front. And there are two 6mm screws that go on the back. The LCD screen is now reattached to the body of the computer with that two-way hinge. Now we have these two cables to connect between the LCD screen and the main body of the computer. The larger connector goes into this flip lock. Make sure it's seated all the way down and then flip it down. And the smaller one goes into this flip lock. You might notice these little tabs here. Those actually tell you when this thing is fully inserted. It has corresponding little tabs on the connector. There, all the way in, and flip lock down. Okay, both cables are now connected. Now we slide in the keyboard bezel, and in order to do that, we have to turn the screen 90 degrees. Now we slide in the bezel underneath the monitor. Now care must be taken with all of these different cables. Now with the RF cables, they're going to go under this part, but over this part. Also be aware of the cable to the button bezel. Now the button bezel is slid all the way into place. Now it's just a matter of snapping it down. Okay, now we need to straighten the monitor and fold it down so that we can flip the laptop over and put the screws on the bottom. The button bezel is held from the underside by 5 screws, 2 3mm screws here and here, and 3 5mm screws here, here, and here. We will put those screws in now. You might have to squeeze these two pieces of plastic together a little bit to get that plastic close enough to reach that very short screw. The 5 screws are now in. Now on the top side, we have to replace the 3 3.5mm silver screws here, here, and here. We'll do that now. We now need to put these 4 RF lines back in that little trench, trying to have as little binding as possible. Keep them arranged together as much as possible, crossing over each other as few times as possible. We start at the top at the LCD screen and we work our way to the lower right towards the Wi-Fi module. Okay. We go to the right of the first hold down tab, and then to the left of this hold down tab. And we go over this tab, to the right of this tab. To the right of this tab. It's just a matter of wrestling with these things. Now we will reconnect the RF module. It was the black wire on top and the gray wire on the bottom. I don't know that it makes any difference. These are always a little tough to snap in. Okay, the Wi-Fi module is now reconnected. Now with all the cables reconnected, I think we should just sort of rotate and flip the monitor to make sure that there's no binding, nothing's getting stretched. Okay, it looks okay. Now we open up the laptop screen all the way so that we can replace the hinge cap. Okay, the hinge cap is back on. Next, we put the palm rest back on. And starting along the bottom, snapping it together. And then the top part. Now we flip it over. The palm rest is held in place with 5 screws on the bottom. And these are here, 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 and here. And they're demarcated by an icon of a rectangle. All 5 of these screws are 5 millimeters in length. We will put them on now. All 5 screws are in. The palm rest is connected with a flip lock flat cable. And we will put that cable back in place now. We get it all the way in, and then we flip the lock, and it clicks into place. Now we replace the keyboard. The keyboard is attached with this flat cable. We will connect that cable now. We then slide the keyboard in on the top first, and then press it down, and then slide it down so all these lower tabs match up. The keyboard is held in place from the underside by 2 screws, here, and they are demarcated with an icon of a keyboard. Both of these screws are 5 millimeters in length. We will now put those 2 screws into place. The screws are now in place. The button bezel will now be replaced. And there is a connector, and it connects to this cable here. This cable connects the fingerprint reader. Being very careful not to damage this cable, we will now snap the button bezel back into place. On the front of the button bezel, there are 3 6mm screws. We will now replace those. On each side of the button bezel, there is a 3mm screw. We'll put those in now. The button bezel has now been secured in place. On the underside of the computer, we will now return parts that we pulled out early on. We will replace the hard drive. Put the cover over the hard drive. And we will screw down that cover. We will replace the pointing device. We will put the battery back in place. And lock it into place. And we have now successfully replaced a defective hinge. Now we can fold our screen back all the way as it should be. And that's it.